A house that grows bigger on the inside as its occupants go mad. The night we arrived at Holloway Mansion, the rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the long dirt road leading to the house into a slosh of mud. Our SUV groaned under the strain, its tires slipping as we navigated the winding path through the forest. The headlights barely pierced the thick mist that clung to the trees, their skeletal branches stretching overhead like bony fingers. "I swear, this place wasn't so far on the map," my husband Dan muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. Beside him, I clutched the directions the realtor had emailed, squinting at the faint blue glow of my phone screen. "It's here," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. There had been a turn somewhere, a fork in the road we hadn't anticipated. But before I could suggest heading back, the house appeared, looming out of the darkness like a specter. The Holloway Mansion was everything the listing had promised, Victorian grandeur frozen in time. It rose 3 stories high, its gabled roof and intricate woodwork framed by vines that clawed at the weathered stone walls. Lightning illuminated the house in brief, blinding flashes, casting jagged shadows that seemed to writhe as if alive. "Looks cozy," Dan said dryly, parking the car at the edge of the circular driveway. Our son, Luke, squirmed awake in the back seat, rubbing his eyes. "Is this it?" he asked, his voice small and groggy. "It looks like the house from that ghost movie." I forced a laugh and tousled his hair. "Don't be silly. It's just an old house, perfect for restoring." Dan grabbed the keys, his skeptical glance lingering on the mansion's silhouette. As we approached, the front door creaked open with a sound like a long, groaning exhale. No one was there. The realtor had assured us the place would be unlocked, but seeing the heavy door swing inward on its own sent a chill down my spine. Inside, the house was a cathedral of shadows. Our footsteps echoed off high ceilings, the polished wood floors gleaming faintly in the dim light. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet, like rotting fruit. At the center of the grand foyer was a staircase that spiraled upward into darkness, its banister carved with intricate patterns of flowers and vines. "It's bigger than I expected," Dan said, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Feels bigger than it looked from outside," I replied, more to myself than anyone else. I couldn't shake the sensation that the space stretched unnaturally, the corners of the room pulling away into shadow as I turned my head. We set to exploring, our voices small against the oppressive silence. The house was furnished, though most of the pieces were draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the flickering light of our flashlights. Each room seemed to branch into another, a sitting room leading to a parlor, the parlor connecting to a library. And then, inexplicably, back to the sitting room. "Did we make a circle?" Dan asked, shining his light on a cluster of family portraits. The faces were blurred with age, their painted eyes glinting faintly as if they were watching us. I didn't answer. Something about the layout felt wrong, as if the house had rearranged itself when we weren't looking. That first night, I convinced myself it was just exhaustion. Houses like these always felt eerie until you settled in. But as I lay in bed listening to the rain lash against the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And when I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamed of the house growing, walls expanding, hallways stretching endlessly, swallowing us whole. The following morning, the storm had cleared, leaving a pale mist that clung to the ground. Luke ran ahead as we unpacked the car, his laughter cutting through the quiet. I envied his excitement. The house already felt oppressive, its walls too close and yet too far, like they were holding their breath. "It's a fixer-upper, but it's got potential," Dan said, brushing cobwebs from an ornate mirror in the foyer. He sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than me. As we moved through the rooms, opening windows to let in light, I noticed strange inconsistencies. The library, which had seemed impossibly vast the night before, now felt cramped, the shelves pressing inward. A door that had led to the kitchen now opened to a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. "Hey, did you see this before?" I called to Dan, who was unpacking boxes in the dining room. He appeared at my side, frowning at the staircase. "Must have missed it. Old houses like this always have hidden surprises, right?" I nodded, but unease churned in my stomach. When I tried to go back to the kitchen later, the door led to a broom closet. Luke was the first to notice something truly strange. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he came running into the living room, his face pale. "Mom, I can't find my room." "What do you mean?" I asked, setting down the stack of plates I was unpacking. "It's gone," he insisted, tugging at my hand. I followed him up the staircase to the second floor, where his room should have been. Instead, the hallway stretched on, impossibly long, its floorboards creaking beneath our feet. "This can't be right," I whispered, gripping Luke's hand tighter. The door to his room was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a single window at the end of the corridor, its glass frosted and unyielding to my touch. When I turned back, the hallway behind us seemed shorter, the walls closing in. Dan found us minutes later, my breathing shallow as I tried to mask my growing fear. "This house is old," he said, his voice calm but forced. "It's bound to feel strange." But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, I could have sworn I heard something. A faint creak, like footsteps moving down the hall. And then faintly I heard Luke's voice, trembling from his room. "Mom, there's someone else here." The house had turned hostile. I woke that morning to the sound of Luke's voice, muffled and panicked, calling from somewhere beyond our room. My heart jolted as I threw the blankets aside and rushed out into the hallway, Dan close behind me. "Luke," I called, my voice sharp with fear. No answer. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the doors on either side warped and uneven. The air was stifling, heavy with a sweet, cloying smell that made my stomach churn. As we ran, the sound of Luke's cries seemed to shift, first ahead, then behind, like the house itself was playing with us. "Stay calm," Dan said, though his face was pale. I wasn't calm. I was drowning in dread. We found him eventually, huddled in a room I didn't recognize, a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings and rows of empty bookshelves. His small body shook as he clutched a blanket, his wide eyes darting to the corners of the room as though something lingered there. "Mom," he whispered when I pulled him into my arms. "It moved." "What moved, sweetheart?" I asked, stroking his hair, though my hands trembled. "The mirror in my room. It's not there anymore. The wall, it's gone. There was just more house." Dan exchanged a worried glance with me, but neither of us spoke. What could we say? We brought Luke back to the main bedroom, keeping him close for the rest of the day. But the house refused to let us settle. When I tried to find the kitchen later that morning, the door led to a narrow passage I had never seen before. I ventured a few steps inside, my fingers brushing against the cold stone walls, but turned back almost immediately. Something about the darkness ahead felt alive, as though it were breathing. The rooms rearranged themselves when we weren't looking. A small sitting room where I'd set up Luke's toys vanished by the afternoon, replaced by a spiraling staircase leading downward. The light bulbs flickered and dimmed, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to linger just a second too long. Dan tried to reason it away. "Settling foundation," he said, though he avoided looking me in the eye. "These old places shift, you know." But the truth clung to us like a second skin. The house was alive. That night, Luke refused to sleep in his own room. I didn't blame him. I made up a bed for him on the couch in the master bedroom, though I doubted any of us would get much rest. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the house creaked and groaned like a beast stirring in its sleep. The darkness felt oppressive, swallowing the faint glow of our bedside lamp. Then I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from somewhere in the walls. "Leave!" I shot up, my breath catching in my throat. Dan stirred beside me, groggily asking what was wrong. I didn't answer. My heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand, like dozens of voices murmuring in unison. The lamp flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, my blood ran cold. Luke's blanket was crumpled on the couch, but he wasn't there. We found Luke moments later, standing at the end of the hallway. His small figure was silhouetted in the faint light coming through a window that hadn't been there before. He wasn't moving, his head tilted slightly as though listening. "Luke," I called, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. Dan and I rushed toward him, but the hallway seemed to stretch longer with each step. My legs felt heavy, the air thick and clinging like molasses. When we reached him, I grabbed his shoulders and turned him toward me. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. "Mom," he whispered, his voice so faint I had to lean closer to hear him. "There's another you." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "She's in there," he said, pointing to a door that hadn't been there the day before. "She looks like you, but she's not." Dan reached for the doorknob, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, the word coming out as a desperate plea. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We can't leave it like this. We need to know what's going on." Before I could stop him, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was immense, far too large to fit within the walls of the house. It stretched endlessly, its wooden floorboards gleaming under a cold, unnatural light. And there, standing in the center, was me. Or rather, something that looked like me. It wore my face, my clothes, but its movements were wrong, jerky and fragmented, like a puppet on invisible strings. Its head snapped toward us, its eyes glinting with a malevolent hunger. "Get out," it said, its voice overlapping with a low, guttural growl. Dan slammed the door shut, his hands trembling. "We're leaving," he said, grabbing Luke and pulling him close. "We're getting out of here tonight." But when we tried to find the front door, it was gone. The house shifted around us, doors opening to empty hallways, windows revealing brick walls. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, echoing from every direction. "Mom," Luke whimpered, clutching my hand tightly. "They're watching us." I looked up and froze. Reflected in the glass of the living room window were not just our shadows, but other versions of us. They moved in disjointed, unnatural ways, their faces twisted into grotesque mockeries of our own. "They're trying to take our place," Dan said, his voice filled with a terror I'd never heard before. I gripped Luke's hand tighter, my heart pounding as the house began to groan around us. We had to get out, before it was too late. The house was devouring us. Walls stretched like elastic, trapping us in endless hallways that led nowhere. The whispers rose to a deafening cacophony, their unintelligible chants vibrating in my skull. Luke clung to my side, his small hand ice-cold, his tear-streaked face buried in my coat. Dan moved ahead of us, his flashlight beam cutting through the suffocating darkness, though the light felt weak, swallowed by the house's pulsing shadows. "We're getting out," Dan said, his voice cracking with panic. "We have to." But the house was alive, and it wasn't letting us go. We turned a corner, and the air grew impossibly heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The walls were no longer plaster. They pulsed like flesh, the faint outline of veins visible under their surface. A low groan reverberated through the corridor, a sound both mechanical and organic. Then, the lights went out. Complete darkness enveloped us. Luke whimpered, and I felt his grip tighten on my hand. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's here." "What's here?" I whispered back, though I didn't want the answer. A flicker of light erupted ahead of us, a faint, eerie glow emanating from a doorway. Against my better judgment, we moved toward it. The room beyond was vast, impossibly large, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center stood a grotesque mirror, its frame writhing as though alive. The glass reflected not us, but the monstrous versions of ourselves we'd glimpsed earlier. They stood motionless, watching us with eyes too bright, too knowing. And then they moved. Their limbs twisted and cracked as they stepped forward, emerging from the mirror like creatures tearing free from a cocoon. My reflection wore a grotesque smile, its eyes black pits that seemed to swallow light. Dan's doppelganger loomed, its arms unnaturally long, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged claws. Luke's reflection was the worst. It was smaller than the others, but its face was featureless, a blank slate save for a wide, gaping mouth that emitted a low, guttural hiss. "They're coming," Luke whimpered, pulling me back. "Run!" Dan shouted, grabbing my arm and dragging us toward another door at the far end of the room. We didn't look back. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps echoed behind us, punctuated by the wet, slithering noise of flesh against wood. The house convulsed as we ran, its walls closing in, the floor buckling beneath our feet. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single guttural voice that resonated through the air. "You cannot leave." But we didn't stop. Dan threw his weight against the door at the end of the hall, and it gave way with a splintering crack. We stumbled through, finding ourselves back in the foyer. The front door loomed ahead, its edges glowing faintly, as if mocking our desperation. "Go!" Dan barked, shoving Luke and me forward. The walls around us groaned, twisting as though the house itself were lunging for us. Blackened tendrils slithered from the ceiling, reaching out like grasping hands. I grabbed the doorknob and twisted. For a moment, it didn't budge, and I thought we were doomed. But then it gave way, the door swinging open to reveal the night outside, a cold, starless void that somehow felt more welcoming than the house. We tumbled out onto the driveway, gasping for air. Behind us, the house screamed, a guttural, otherworldly sound that shook the ground. I turned, expecting to see it collapsing, but instead it seemed to shrink, folding inward on itself until it was no larger than a dollhouse. And then it was gone. We sat in stunned silence, the chill of the night biting at our skin. Luke buried his face in my shoulder, his sobs muffled. Dan wrapped an arm around us both, his breath ragged. "It's over," he said, though his voice held no conviction. But I knew better. As we drove away, the headlights cutting through the mist, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I saw the house, tall, looming, and impossibly dark, standing where we had left it. And in one of its windows, something moved, something that looked like me.